Welcome to Night Radios, where every story is a soft whisper, and every whisper leads you gently into sleep. Let the world fade away just for a while. Tonight, I have a story just for you. Have you ever wondered what stories an old attic could tell if someone finally stopped to listen? Tonight, you'll meet a little black cat who guards forgotten memories and discovers that even dust can dream. Before we begin the story, don't forget to like, share this video, and subscribe to the channel. Your support means the world to us and helps us bring you even more heartfelt stories like this one. At the far edge of a quiet town, where the sidewalks ended and the trees began to lean a little closer together, there stood a house that didn't mind being forgotten. Its windows were clouded with time, and ivy had grown up the sides, like the house had pulled a blanket over its shoulders. On nights when the moon felt generous, it would slip through a crack in the attic window and rest on the floor like a memory too soft to speak aloud. In that attic, surrounded by boxes sealed with tape that had long given up, lived a small black cat named Whiskers. He wasn't anyone's cat, not anymore. He didn't belong to the house, though the house had made a quiet sort of peace with his presence. Whiskers had fur like evening shadows and eyes that held the stillness of a place people used to love. He moved without sound, his paws silent over the wooden floor. Each day, he traced the same familiar path, past the same old trunks and leaning shelves, like he was checking in on something fragile. There was a teddy bear in the corner, its ear sewn back on with red thread that had frayed like a secret someone had whispered too often. Whiskers would nudge it gently with his nose, not to play, but to say hello. The bear never answered, but it seemed to remember how to listen. Beside it, tucked into the folds of a woolen blanket, sat a music box, the kind that once spun and sang. The ballerina inside stood still now, arms lifted, gaze frozen mid-well. Her paint had faded, but the posture of hope had never left her. Whiskers sometimes curled around the box, as if to share his warmth with the cold metal key that no longer turned. And on the wall, barely holding on by a bent nail, was a sketch in pencil. A child's face, smiling with the ease of someone who hadn't learned what it meant to lose yet. The paper had yellowed at the edges, but the smile hadn't changed. Whiskers didn't know who the child was, or who had held the bear, or wound the box, or drawn the picture, but he felt their presence, like the way dust floats where sunlight used to fall. There were no footsteps anymore, no laughter on the stairs, just the breath of the house, long and slow, as if it were remembering too. Whiskers sat by the window most nights, tail curled around his side, eyes half closed as if in prayer. He wasn't waiting, not exactly, but he wasn't done hoping either. Sometimes the wind would whisper through the window frame, brushing past the boxes with a sound like old paper. When it did, Whiskers would listen closely, ears tilting toward the soft hush. There are whispers here, gentle ones. He didn't say it aloud, but the thought settled inside him like something he'd known all along. He had started to wonder things he couldn't explain, small, quiet thoughts that crept in between his naps and wandered around like guests, too shy to stay. If no one remembers these things, if the bear stays quiet, and the box never plays, and the drawing keeps fading, do they still matter? That question stayed with him longer than most. It didn't hurt, not exactly. It was just heavy in a quiet sort of way. Sometimes he would lie beside the ballerina and imagine her spinning again, to a tune he couldn't hear but could almost feel. Other times he'd rest his head near the bear and try to picture the child who once pulled it close on stormy nights. But he never pictured himself in any of those memories, because he didn't know if he belonged to them or if he was just passing through. The attic didn't offer answers. It only gave him stillness and the feeling that he wasn't quite as alone as the silence made it seem. He wasn't sure if the objects needed remembering to matter, or if they mattered simply because they were still here, still present, still whole in some forgotten way. The thoughts made his tail flick once, then settle, and just before the moon sank below the edge of the window, casting the attic back into soft shadow, Whiskers whispered something to no one in particular. What if being forgotten doesn't mean we disappear? There was no reply, but the house, in its own gentle rhythm, seemed to breathe out, as if it understood, and Whiskers closed his eyes, not to sleep, but to stay, just a little longer. It was the kind of night that made the curtains breathe. The wind wasn't angry or wild, just restless, like it had something to say and didn't know how to begin. The attic window clicked once, then again, as if it were being tapped gently by a visitor with no hands. Whiskers lifted his head. He had been curled up beside the music box, half asleep, not quite dreaming but not fully awake either. But now, the air in the room had shifted. The quiet wasn't so still anymore. There was something in it like the hum before a thought becomes a word. Whiskers stood and stretched, his back arching like a slow ripple through the floorboards. He blinked up at the cracked window pane. Moonlight spilled through it in a soft, silver slope, pooling on the attic floor and turning the dust into glitter. And in that light, something strange appeared. Shadows, long and narrow, stacking atop one another. They looked like steps. Not real ones, not wooden or nailed or built by anyone's hand, but steps, nonetheless, floating ones, the kind that don't go up or down, just forward. Whiskers tilted his head. He wasn't sure what was waiting out there. He only knew that something had knocked, twice, and something inside him knocked back. He paced once around the edge of the attic, the way he always did before the sun went down. He looked at the bear, the music box, the sketch on the wall. They all looked back at him the way quiet things do, without blinking, but with presence. He stood by the edge of the window and placed one paw on the sill. The wood was damp and a little cold. The wind brushed past his whiskers. It didn't push, it invited. He turned once more to glance at the attic behind him. It looked like it always had dim dust soft, full of stories too quiet to be told. But now, for the first time, it felt smaller, not lesser, just not everything. Whiskers blinked slowly. What if there's more to life than waiting in the dust? He hadn't meant to think it so loudly, but once the question found its shape, it clung to him like the breeze itself. And so, without further ceremony, Whiskers pressed his small body through the narrow window frame and leaped down onto the roof tiles, slick with night rain. Soft landing, softer decision. The town stretched beneath him like a forgotten lullaby, familiar in shape but missing a few notes. Lights twinkled far off. Branches swayed like they were waving him on. He padded carefully along the sloped edge, his paws light against the shingles. Below him, the world exhaled. Above him, the clouds parted slightly to reveal a moon that hadn't finished deciding what shape it wanted to be tonight. This was not a journey planned. There was no bag packed, no farewell, only a pull. It came not from outside, but from something small and steady inside him, something that had begun to wonder what else there was beyond the attic, beyond the dust, beyond the memories that weren't his to keep. The wind circled him like a scarf unraveling, and for the first time in a long while, Whiskers didn't feel like something left behind. He felt like something in motion. He hopped from the main roof to the low garden shed, then to the top of the fence. The night was soft under his paws, though the air still held a cool bite of late spring. No one else was awake, but Whiskers didn't feel alone. He didn't know where he was going. There was no map, no plan, just a quiet knowing. And in some gentle, wordless way, that was enough. As he reached the end of the fence and paused to look back at the old house, its outline slouched in the dark like a sleeping friend, he didn't feel like he was leaving it. Not really. He was carrying it with him. Not the walls or the window or the dust, but the whispers, the ones that had started the moment the wind knocked twice. And now, with the moon above and the attic behind, Whiskers followed the pull in his chest, into the night, with no questions louder than his footsteps, and no answer clearer than the quiet ache of wonder. He didn't know what he would find, only that something out there was waiting to be remembered. And maybe, just maybe, it was waiting for him. The wind had followed Whiskers like a soft companion, curling round his paws and brushing gently against his ears. Never too bold, always just present enough to remind him he wasn't walking alone. The fence he padded along creaked slightly beneath his weight. It was old grey with time and softened by years of sun and storm. Each board leaned in a little, as if listening to its own slow decay. Whiskers moved carefully, step by step, his tail trailing behind like a slow thought. Above him, the sky had begun to spill silver. Not quite starlight, not quite moon. Just that quiet, familiar light that made things shimmer if you looked softly. He paused when the wind changed direction. It wasn't colder, just different, like it had turned to point him toward something waiting. To his right stood a tree. Its trunk was thick, worn smooth where the bark had curled in like old hands around memory. Branches stretched out with an almost sleepy bend, and most of them were bare now, naked and still, except for one. Just one leaf remained, golden and tired looking, clinging to a thin branch near the top, like a lone word at the end of a sentence no one finished writing. It quivered, not from panic, but from patience. Whiskers stopped at the base of the tree and looked up. The leaf shimmered slightly in the wind, the same way a candle wobbles before remembering how to stand tall again. He tilted his head. "Why are you still here, little leaf?" The leaf rustled faintly, as if gathering its thoughts. Then it spoke, not with sound, but with that soft kind of language that travels on air and lands directly in the chest. "I don't remember what comes next," it said. "I was once green. I danced in spring breezes and laughed in summer storms. But now I just hold on." Whiskers sat down slowly, curling his tail around his feet. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The wind did the talking for a while. It swirled gently around the tree, slipping between branches and catching the edges of bark like a breath that didn't want to be noticed. The leaf wobbled again. Not hard, not desperate, just enough to say it had heard the wind's song. "I used to know when to let go," the leaf murmured, almost like remembering a lullaby. "But when everything quiets down, I forget whether the fall is the end or just the part no one tells stories about." Whiskers blinked slowly. He didn't know what came after the fall either. but he knew what it felt like to hold on so long that your whole body forgot how to rest. So he waited. The tree didn't move. The ground didn't urge. But the wind, ever so softly, rose just enough to lift the leaf from its branch and carry it downward. It didn't tumble. It didn't spin. It simply drifted, slowly, gracefully, like it had finally remembered the way. Before it touched the ground, the leaf sighed so faintly Whiskers almost missed it. "Falling isn't the end," it said. "It's the next dance." And then it landed, quietly, gently, with the kind of peace that doesn't announce itself. Whiskers didn't move for a while. He looked at the empty branch where the leaf had been, then at the place it now rested, golden against the earth, like a memory ready to settle. He thought about the attic, about the bear with the stitched ear, the music box that didn't sing anymore, the smile in the drawing. And he wondered if maybe everything, even things that forget how to fall, are simply waiting to be seen. Just once more, before they let go. He stood, stretching gently, and began to walk again, this time a little slower, a little lighter, carrying the whisper of that last leaf's truth in the quiet between his steps. And though the wind no longer pulled at his fur the same way, it hummed behind him with a kind of knowing, as if another part of the journey had just begun. The rain came softly at first, like a thought changing its mind. It tapped gently on leaves, paused on rooftops, then slid down windows like fingers trailing across forgotten glass. Whiskers, still damp from the mist along the fence, followed the scent of wood and ash. He wasn't looking for shelter, exactly, but something in the rain made him remember how it felt to be near warmth. He crossed a narrow yard where weeds had grown taller than memory and found himself beneath the awning of an old house. Its porch had caved a little on one side, and ivy pressed against the walls as if the vines themselves were trying to keep the house from slipping away. Through a gap in the wood, something glowed, not brightly, not like flame or fire or even candlelight. It was quieter than that, a flicker tucked behind the boards, barely there. Whiskers stood still. Then, carefully, he pushed his way inside through a broken panel near the corner of the porch. The room inside was draped in quiet. Dust clung to the air like it didn't want to settle. A table stood crooked, its legs uneven. The wallpaper had peeled like old bark, curling at the corners. But in the center of it all, in the heart of the room that had no beating sound, was a fireplace, cracked brick, chipped stone. And nestled deep inside, barely rising above the ash, a flame, small but stubborn. Its glow wavered like breath on a cold morning. Whiskers approached slowly, as if not to startle it. The warmth reached him before the light did, sliding into his fur like a memory returning. He lowered himself beside the hearth. The stone was cool beneath his paws, but the air near the flame shimmered with life. He watched the little fire dance, no music, no rush, just motion, just presence. "Are you still burning?" he asked softly. The flicker seemed to pause, then stretch upward, just a little. "Not for myself," it answered, voice quiet but steady, "but for the ones who once needed me." Whiskers nodded without moving. He didn't ask who they were. He didn't need to. He curled beside the hearth, tail tucked beneath him, and listened, not for words, for warmth. For the way heat hums in silence, the way it speaks without flame. The flicker pulsed slowly, like it was remembering. The stories that had once filled this room, the laughter that had echoed off the walls, the hands that warmed themselves here on cold evenings, the eyes that stared into the fire while secrets softened inside them. "I'm not as bright as I used to be," the flicker murmured, as if embarrassed. Whiskers blinked, long and slow. "That's not what matters," he said. "You're still here." The flicker sighed in response. Not sad, not tired, just present. Time passed, but neither of them noticed how long. The storm outside grew quieter, the way storms do when they've said all they came to say. Inside, the shadows shifted slightly, stretching longer along the walls like they, too, were growing sleepy. Whiskers stood and gave one last glance toward the flame. It had not grown larger, it had not gone out, but somehow it had deepened. As he stepped toward the doorway, the flicker spoke again. "Even if no one sits beside me anymore," it said, "I still remember the stories they told by my light." Whiskers paused, and for a moment, something ancient and gentle passed between them. The kind of understanding that doesn't need to be said aloud. The kind that travels in warmth, not words. He stepped into the night, where the rain had faded to a whisper, and as the breeze wrapped softly around him again, he carried the glow with him, not in his fur, but in the silence between his steps. Because sometimes the smallest light lives longest when someone remembers to stop and simply feel its warmth. The rain had passed without saying goodbye. It left the world behind in soft puddles and dripping leaves, and the sky peeled open just wide enough for a little blue to slip through. Whiskers moved along a quiet road where grasses bent with weight and fences leaned with age. His paws left no sound, only small, wet prints that disappeared almost as soon as they were made. Ahead stood a house with a rounded porch roof that drooped slightly in the middle. It looked as though someone had once loved it, then stepped away slowly, careful not to wake the walls. The front step was cracked but clean. No vines had climbed here. No branches scratched the siding. Only stillness lived there now. Stillness and one sound, a wind chime. Not the kind that danced in every breeze or called out loudly with joy. This one had just two remaining rods, suspended by a bit of thinning string. They hung unevenly, swaying in opposite directions, sometimes near enough to touch, sometimes not. They whispered when they met, not a song, a breath, ting, ting, like the last notes of a lullaby no one had sung for years. Whiskers sat beneath the chime, beside a cracked flower pot filled with dirt that remembered flowers. He tilted his head and listened. The wind nudged the air again. "Ting, why are you still here?" he asked gently. "You're missing parts." The chime answered slowly, as if it had to remember how to speak. "I'm not as loud as I once was," it said. "I lost a piece of myself in the last storm." Whiskers looked up at the crooked beams and the way the rope frayed like a worn shoelace. "But your song is still here," he replied softly. "And maybe softer songs are just closer to dreams." The chime didn't answer, but it moved, just a little, just enough. The wind returned, stronger this time but not rough. It rolled in like a wave, remembering how to kiss the shore, and the chime responded. Not with clarity, not with music that reached the ends of the street, but with a sound that wrapped around the porch like a memory looking for someone to recognize it. Ting, ting, ting. A shaky rhythm, imperfect, but brave. Whiskers closed his eyes. He could almost hear someone humming along. A child, maybe, swinging their feet from the porch steps, or an old man watching the sky fold into dusk. There was a grace to it, this broken harmony, as if the missing pieces had taught the chime how to speak more softly to the ones who needed quiet. He looked up again and saw the wind moving through the space where the missing rods should have been. And still, the chime sang. Whiskers rose to his feet. He didn't want to leave, but he didn't need to stay. The song would linger, he knew that now, not because it was loud or long, but because it had been heard. He took one last glance at the porch, at the place where music had found a way to exist in silence. And as he stepped back onto the path, the chime let out one final whisper, a delicate note that seemed to land right behind his heart and stay there. Not every melody is made to echo wide. Some are meant for small rooms, half-open windows, and ears that know how to listen gently. The rooftops glittered under the open moon, stretching like a patchwork of silver and slate. Whiskers, now familiar with the soft rhythm of traveling by rooftop, made his way carefully across the shingles, one paw in front of the other, his body low and balanced. The night was wide and generous. Above him, stars blinked sleepily. Below, chimneys dozed and gutters hummed faintly with leftover rain. He liked the height. It felt safe, not because it was far from the ground, but because, from up here, everything seemed slower, more dreamlike, more distant from whatever troubled the streets below. But the thing about rooftops, even the ones that hold you gently, is that sometimes a single tile can forget how to stay. It happened so quickly. One loose shingle, one step to light, and suddenly the world tilted. Whiskers slipped. His body twisted mid-air, not wildly, but as if trying to remember how to land softly. Then, a thud, a rustle of trash, a stillness. He had fallen between buildings, into a narrow, sunless alley wedged between two forgotten walls. There was no grass here, no stars, just cracked concrete and cardboard, old crates leaning like tired shoulders, and puddles that didn't shine. Whiskers didn't move at first. Not because he was hurt, but because he couldn't tell if he was still part of the night, or something that had fallen out of it. The silence here wasn't peaceful. It was too thick, too heavy, the kind of silence that doesn't let anything in, and forgets to let anything out. No wind, no moonlight, no gentle sounds to keep him company. Only Whiskers, only the dark, and the quiet that didn't seem to care if he was there. He sat up slowly, his legs trembling not from pain, but from the hush that surrounded him, like a room where the door had been closed too long. He curled his tail around himself, pressing his nose into his fur. He wanted to be small, smaller than he already was, small enough to disappear without a sound. The thought came, uninvited, but certain, soft and sharp, like a splinter beneath the skin of his mind. What if I'm just another lost thing in a world full of lost things? He didn't cry, not out loud, but something inside him folded inward, like paper dipped in rain. He stayed that way for a while, still, curled, listening for nothing, and then, just when the silence had begun to press too tightly, there it was, a sound, faint, delicate, wavering, not metal, not wind, a voice. It didn't call his name, it didn't even speak words, it sang, a lullaby, if lullabies could sigh, shaky, like it had forgotten its tune, but kind, a melody made of dust and memory, and something more human than the walls around him. Whiskers lifted his head. The song drifted from somewhere deeper in the alley, not near, not far, just enough to reach him. He stood, legs unsteady, and began to follow the sound. step by step, guided not by sight, but by the hush between each note, and the way it settled inside his ribs like the warmth of someone's palm. He didn't know who was singing, or why, or how, but he knew this. He was no longer alone, and as he moved slowly toward the voice, he began to feel as if the night had remembered him after all. The alley grew narrower the farther Whiskers went, as though the world had grown unsure of how much space he deserved. The light behind him had long faded, swallowed by damp walls and weary shadows. Only the melody remained soft and trembling, like a hand learning how to hold again. He followed it the way one follows warmth in winter, not with urgency, but with quiet longing. The song drifted like ash, barely there, but impossible to ignore. It floated above the ground, between puddles and crates, past rusted pipes and crooked bricks. At the far end of the alley, where the wind didn't reach and the streetlights forgot to glow, he found her. An old woman, sitting on the bottom step of a forgotten building, wrapped in a shawl that looked like it had been made from memory itself. The threads were uneven, some faded, some frayed, but together they formed a shape that felt whole. Her hands moved gently over a small, tattered teddy bear resting in her lap. Its fur worn thin from years of being held, then missed, then held again. Her eyes, clouded and closed, didn't lift when Whiskers approached, but her head tilted just slightly. He slowed, sat, watched her from a few feet away. She kept humming, low and slow. Then, as if she had been waiting for that exact sound, his breath, his pause, she smiled. "Ah," she said, her voice lined with gravel and honey. "I've been waiting for a listener, not a looker." Whiskers crept closer. He didn't meow, he didn't purr. He simply curled up beside her and laid his head on the edge of her skirt, the way a child might rest against a story they've heard before but forgotten how it ends. Her hand moved from the bear to his back, fingers trembling as they met the softness of fur. "There you are," she whispered. "You feel the same, or close enough." The alley didn't change, but something within it softened. The old woman, whose name was Mabel, began to speak, not loudly and not for long. She told stories in pieces, like broken shells you still keep in a box. Children who once played hopscotch in the alley's cracks. Songs that echoed off these walls when windows were still open. A bakery that used to leave its back door ajar, just wide enough for a cat or two. "I may be blind now," she said, still stroking Whiskers' back, "but I remember light." She tilted her head again, as if looking through time. "And I remember the warmth of a purring cat. Maybe it was you. Maybe it still is." Whiskers didn't answer. He didn't need to. The wind had not returned. The moon had not found this corner. But the silence no longer felt heavy. It felt held. "I tell these stories," Mabel said, "because if I don't, they'll stop breathing. Dust remembers, you know, but only if someone asks it to." She laughed then, not loudly, just once. The kind of laugh you let out when the ache in your chest turns into something gentle. Whiskers nuzzled against the bear in her lap. It didn't smell like anyone, but it didn't smell like no one either. She kept humming after that. Not the same melody. Something older. Something that belonged to the space between words. And he listened. Because listening was all he had to give. And sometimes that was enough. They stayed like that for a long while. A blind woman with stories in her hands, and a black cat who knew how to sit still without falling asleep. At some point, Mabel stopped humming. She didn't speak again. She just sat with him until the quiet turned warm, and in that quiet, Whiskers realized something he hadn't known he'd been looking for. Some things don't need eyes to be seen. Some memories don't fade if someone remembers to tell them, and some corners of the world only come alive when you're not in a hurry to leave. The alley gave way to silence once more as Whiskers stepped into the edge of a street that had long stopped asking to be remembered. The pavement was cracked in places, and tufts of grass grew where shoes no longer passed. Windows blinked shut behind curtains that hadn't been drawn in years, and mailboxes stood empty, their mouths yawning toward nothing. But at the corner, where the road curved gently toward a hill too tired to climb, stood a single streetlight, tall, rusted, covered in a fine coat of dust that shimmered like ash in the moonlight, and glowing, not brightly, not with the hunger of new bulbs or polished glass, but steady, faint, warm in the way an old sweater is warm not because of heat, but because of time. Whiskers padded closer, paws soft against the curb, ears twitching at the low hum in the air. The rest of the lamps along the street had long gone dark, their sockets hollow, their posts leaning slightly like forgetful giants. But this one remained, still shining, still here. Whiskers sat beneath it, letting the glow fall across his fur in slow, golden waves. It didn't chase away the dark. It didn't try to. It simply stayed lit, as if to say the dark didn't have to go to make space for something gentle. He looked up. "Why do you still shine, glow?" he asked softly. There was a pause, just long enough to be felt. Then, in a voice that crackled like wire warming back to life, the streetlight replied, "Because I promised the night I would. Even if no one notices, I'm still part of the story." Whiskers blinked, slowly. A breeze passed, light enough to lift a dry leaf, and nothing more. He curled up at the base of the post, the metal cold against his side, but the light above him warmer than any blanket he'd ever known. Glow continued, its voice low, threaded with quiet conviction. Not everything bright needs to be seen. Sometimes we shine just to remind the darkness it's not alone. The words hung in the air like dust in sunbeams, slow, floating, certain. Whiskers rested his head against his paws. He didn't speak, didn't blink, didn't sleep. He simply let the light hold him. It wasn't the kind of glow you tell stories about. It wasn't magic or brave or grand. It didn't light the whole street. Just enough. Enough for one cat. Enough for one step. Enough for the space between two strangers who never knew each other's names, but somehow shared the same quiet. Whiskers breathed in slowly, the way you do when you don't want to forget a moment. The world around him stayed dim, but something inside didn't. He didn't need to ask Glow anything else. Some lights speak once and leave the rest to feeling. And when Whiskers finally rose and walked away, the light didn't flicker or fade. It simply stayed, a promise wrapped in gold. A small, tired star, still choosing to shine. By the time Whiskers found himself back near the old house, the wind had grown quieter, as if it, too, had begun to tire. The moon was lower now, resting against the chimney tops, like it needed something to lean on. The stars blinked less often, and the night folded in, calm and close. Whiskers didn't go to the attic, not yet. Instead, he padded softly around the back of the house, where vines curled against broken siding and the grass grew higher than it had any right to. A wooden staircase sloped downward from the back porch, hugging the wall like a thought no one had spoken in a long time. The wood was splintered, and worn pale from rain and forgetting. Moss grew at its base like a whisper that never dried. It creaked as Whiskers stepped onto the first stair, but not the kind of creak that complains, more like a sigh, a recognition. He sat on the second step, the one with the little crack that curved like a smile. The air smelled of old leaves and the earth that waited underneath them. "Has anyone walked here recently?" Whiskers asked, his voice small but not uncertain. There was a pause, and then the staircase answered, its voice thin and brittle, like the edge of a page too long untouched. "No, but I remember the footsteps, the laughter, the small shoes. I hold them even if no one steps on me anymore." Whiskers closed his eyes for a moment. He could almost hear it, the beat of 2 feet hopping down in rhythm, a giggle chasing the sound, a hand brushing the rail before slipping away. Each step held a story, even the broken ones, even the ones covered in dust. He rose gently and began to climb. The wood beneath him felt different, less sharp, less tired. Each creak sounded more like a note than a complaint, like the stair was learning to hum again under the weight of something light. The higher he went, the more the staircase seemed to come alive just a little. Not loudly, just enough. As if his paws were waking something. By the 4th step, the air felt warmer. By the 6th, the silence wasn't so still. At the top, where the porch met a door that hadn't been opened in what could have been a decade, Whiskers paused. He didn't push it open, didn't need to. It was enough just to have walked the stairs. Enough to remind them they were still a way to somewhere, even if no one remembered what that somewhere once was. The staircase, whose name was Timber, creaked once more beneath him. A soft sound, a thank you, perhaps. "We are remembered not by how loud our stories were," Timber said, his voice no longer broken but rounded with warmth, "but by who dares to climb them again." Whiskers stood quietly at the top, his tail curled round his feet. The house behind him did not stir. The night did not cheer, but something had shifted. Some places wait not to be restored, only remembered, only touched again by something kind. As he turned and walked back down, each step felt less like a descent and more like a soft return. And the stairs, the old, creaking, patient stairs, no longer waited to be named. They already were. The door didn't resist. It creaked open slowly, like someone stretching after a very long nap. The hinges groaned, not from age, but from being unused for too many quiet seasons. Whiskers stepped through. The attic waited. The air smelled the same dust and sun that had soaked into the floorboards years ago and never left. But something felt different. It wasn't the shape of the room, not the slant of the ceiling or the narrow beams overhead. It was the stillness. It no longer felt like a stillness made from forgetting. It felt aware, like the room had taken a breath. And for the first time in a very long time, it was holding that breath with purpose. Whiskers walked softly across the wooden planks, his paws making almost no sound. The moonlight filtered in through the crack in the window, just as it always had. But tonight, it fell in a wider pool, as if the moon had leaned closer, curious. He passed the box that used to rattle when he brushed it. Now, it sat still, tucked in its place. The teddy bear that had once slumped sideways on a folded blanket now rested upright, leaning gently against the wall. Its stitched ear looked straighter, its fur brushed. Not new, not fixed, but remembered. The music box still didn't play. Its ballerina stood frozen mid-whirl, arms poised in hope. but the dust that once coated her glass world was gone. Something had wiped it clean. Whiskers moved to the small wooden toy truck. It had been broken, once missing a wheel, off balance. Now, beside it, a smooth, round pebble nestled just where the wheel had been, placed gently, perfectly, not to make it work again, just to make it whole. Whiskers sat down in the center of the room. He didn't curl up, not yet. He just looked round, at the old trunk with the faded stickers, at the faded curtain that fluttered without wind, at the space that had once felt forgotten. Everything was still old, still quiet, but no longer lonely. Something had shifted, not all at once, not with noise, but with care. He laid down slowly, the wood cool beneath him, and for the first time since he began his journey, he didn't feel like a keeper of things that didn't matter. He felt like part of something that had never truly ended. The attic was awake, and he had helped wake it, maybe not with his paws, not with his voice, but with his noticing, with his being there long enough to remember what others had forgotten. He closed his eyes, not to sleep, but to rest, to breathe in the warmth of what had been made whole again. And the story whispered, maybe home isn't just a place. Maybe home is where memories wait patiently until we are ready to listen. Around him, the shadows softened. The toys leaned closer to one another. The air settled into the quiet hum of belonging, and the dust that once made things fade now danced gently in the moonlight, like it had a story of its own to tell. The sky had barely begun to change. It was the kind of morning that arrived slowly, like a blanket being pulled back from the world one fold at a time. Light crept in quietly through the cracks in the attic window, just enough to wake the dust, but not enough to wake the world. Whiskers opened his eyes to the soft sound of wooden steps, not loud, not hurried, just small feet, careful and curious, pressing gently into the staircase he'd climbed the night before. He didn't move, not right away. Instead, he listened. Each step spoke, not in creaks, but in memory, as if the stairs had been waiting a long time to feel something that light again. Then came the knock, not on the front door, not on the window, but on the attic door, once, then a pause. Then again, this time slower, like someone was asking permission, not entry. The latch clicked, the hinges shifted, and the door, heavy with years, opened. There, in the pale light of morning, stood a child, no older than 7. Backpack slung over one shoulder, shoes a little too big, as if meant for growing into, eyes calm and wide, the color of early autumn leaves. The child didn't gasp, didn't hesitate, just stepped inside, saw Whiskers, and smiled. Whiskers didn't run, didn't arch his back, didn't blink. He stayed where he was, curled in the same spot where moonlight had once rested. The child crossed the room, slow and steady, and sat down beside him. No rush, no noise, just presence. One small hand reached out and began to stroke the soft black fur behind Whiskers' ears. "I used to play here," the child whispered, voice quiet enough to stay inside the walls. "This used to be my grandfather's house." Fingers paused for a moment, then continued. "He told me stories about a little black cat who watched over memories." Whiskers tilted his head, ears flicking gently. The child's smile grew wide, but not loud, the kind of smile that came with a long remembering. He said, "The cat never left," the child said. He said, "The attic stayed warm because someone still listened." For a moment, the only sound was breathing shared between them, light and even. The attic didn't feel old now. It didn't feel forgotten. It felt like something had come back to complete a circle that had never quite closed. Whiskers leaned into the child's side, just slightly. The child leaned back, and for the first time in years, the attic echoed with a new sound. Not laughter, not voices, just presence, and it was enough. After a while, the child reached into the backpack and pulled out a notebook. Its corners were bent, the cover soft from use. A pencil looped through the spiral. Opening it slowly, the child turned to the first page and read aloud, not to Whiskers, but to the room. To whoever finds this, they began. If you see a little black cat on the attic, listen closely. He knows stories the world has forgotten. Whiskers blinked once, and in that blink, something inside the attic quiet as breath, deep as dust settled. The child set the notebook down on the old toy chest, where it could wait for the next visitor. Then they sat a little longer, not needing anything more than to be there. Sometimes, the story doesn't end when the telling stops. Sometimes, it waits inside fur and wood and the hum of something never quite gone. And sometimes, it takes a child to knock just once and let the remembering begin again. That evening, the sky arrived in a softer shade of blue, the kind that didn't ask for attention. It simply settled. The attic welcomed the hush with open beams and gentle shadows. Light poured in like a final word, warm and gold where it touched the floor, cooler where it climbed the edges of old trunks and picture frames. Whiskers returned to his place. He didn't rush, didn't glance around, didn't hesitate. He knew where everything belonged now. Not just the boxes and bears, but the feelings, the memories, the things that had once hovered without names. Tonight, the attic didn't feel like a room full of forgotten objects. It felt like a room that had been remembered. Each item sat where it could be seen again, not by eyes alone, but by heart. The teddy bear rested squarely on its blanket, paws gently folded as though it were waiting for a bedtime story. The music box gleamed faintly beneath the window, its glass smooth and clear. Though it remained silent, its silence had changed. It was no longer stuck, it was simply still. The little wooden truck, with its stone wheel, faced the wall as if it had turned around to whisper something only the attic could hear. Whiskers stepped quietly between them all and settled into the space between old rugs and quiet laughter, where the air always smelled like memory. He curled his body around itself, paws tucked close, not because he was cold, but because everything around him felt full. Outside, a wind passed by, not loud or restless, just enough to find the narrow space beneath the window pane. It brought with it a sound soft and slow, the far-off ting of a wind chime, almost too quiet to name, and through the beam of pale moonlight, the attic stirred not with movement, but with awareness. Whiskers looked once toward the door, the way someone might glance back at a story before the final page, but he didn't get up. He didn't need to. The question he used to carry heavy and unsure was no longer with him. He didn't ask, "Do I matter?" Not anymore. He simply whispered, "Thank you for remembering." And then, Whiskers closed his eyes, not to sleep, not to leave, but to become part of the room, part of the dust and the wood and the light that never left completely. No paw prints, no soft meows, no stirring in the dark, only the sound of breath, the kind that belongs not to a body, but to a space that remembers being loved. And in that stillness, a whisper lingered, not on lips, not in wind, but in the air around the attic. The kind of whisper that doesn't need to be heard out loud to be believed. So close your eyes now, little one, because even an attic sleeps, and even a black cat dreams. Sometimes, the quietest places hold the loudest echoes, and the smallest hearts carry the weight of stories no one remembers them till someone chooses to listen. So what about you? Is there a forgotten place, or a quiet moment from your past, still waiting to be heard? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below, and if this story warmed your heart, even just a little, don't forget to subscribe to Night Radios, where every whisper matters, and every night has a tale worth dreaming through. Sweet dreams, until next time.